We're going to do a little something different that's not on the program. It'll just take a minute. For those of you who were here last night, you know that we were supposed to have two speakers talking about disenfranchisement and the prison industrial complex, one of whom is Sekwan Merritt, who's standing next to me. The other one is Marcus Lilly, who couldn't get here, even though his tickets were booked and paid for and his hotel was set and he was ready to go and he was trying to check on, because at the very last minute, the Baltimore parole department just said, you can't go, for no reason that's justifiable at all. So we don't want to accept that. And so what we're going to do, although we didn't fix it, but we don't want to accept it. So what we want to do is say something to him, to Marcus. So I'm going to actually, and we're going to do that by way of Facebook Live. So I'm actually going to turn it over to Sekwan here to actually tell you what to do.
Or I want to do it. All right. So now I pretty much have it on live, and Akima is watching. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this around, and so y'all can talk to Akima, because what we were trying to do is a lot of people kind of felt for his situation and that he couldn't make it up here. This is what I would call a brother of mine, and we have been doing awesome as we transition and re-enter into society, trying to influence guys to make better decisions and also be role models for the others that are incarcerated that may be on their way home in the next year or two or 3-4 years. So, as I said, unfortunately, I didn't even want to post anything on Facebook about me being in Boston, because we are friends and we're supposed to have been here together. We had speeches made. He had this thing drawn up to really, blow you guys' mind. But here he is right here. He's watching. So for everybody, I guess if someone wants to say something or really wants to send him words of encouragement, he sees everything now. This is really happening. So Akima, man, this everybody, man, sending love, man. You know what I mean? So, I told him, man, that, regardless of what, he's here with me, man. So, all right, man. So, man, he's watching, man. He says, thank you. And, all right, I'm adding him on now. Because y'all got to remember, I'm still new to this technology on Facebook Live work. So it's saying bring him on camera, and it's adding him. So I guess he sees it. But thank y'all. Oh, here you go. He's actually watching. There you go. He said, hey, y'all. There you go. Yeah, that's how I work. I made it work. I did it. There you go, bro, man. So I don't know if you can hear. Hey, came and say something. Hello?
And I appreciate all the love. I definitely appreciate all the love.
Okay. Oh, you're right.
Thank y'all for sending me so much love. Can they hear me?
Yeah, they can hear you. You're on the mic. They just told me how to do it.
Do your presentation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I really can't do my whole presentation. So first I want to say it's very unfortunate that I can't be there. I wish I was very upset. But the system is really not designed, in my opinion, for us to be successful. So those hurdles and those obstacles are to be expected. So I'm just dealing with it. But I definitely appreciate the love that everyone's been sending me. And although it's really not my fault, I apologize for the inconvenience of me not being there. What I was going to say basically in my presentation was I was going to focus on education in prison. Can y'all still hear me?
Yeah, we can still hear you, man.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. All right. Yeah, don't be afraid to let me know what to do.
Hi, everybody.
All right, my bad, Kim. All right.
Excuse the gloves. I'm in here washing dishes, so. In my opinion, we as a society, need to focus more on rehabilitation because the prison system is centered on punishment. And for me, I always use this analogy. The same youth offender that we send to prison, that we don't give incentive to participate in college-based programs or the self-help programs, will be the same youth offenders that return back into our society. And those youth offenders will, majority of them, in my opinion, will go on to commit more crimes. And I feel like law officials who don't put more into education and rehabilitation because of many excuses, maybe lack of funding, or maybe just not the passion to really rehabilitate incarcerated citizens, in my opinion, they contribute to further crimes in our community. It's like sins of omission, because we, and I use the word we loosely because although I love America, sometimes I feel like I'm not a part of America. I feel like I'm disenfranchised, so I use the word we loosely. But we as a people have the power to help reform the prison system and have it geared toward rehabilitation or centered on rehabilitation. So I always use this analogy, even though it's a Marvel comic movie. It's a very powerful analogy for me, and I think it always hits my point. In the first Spider-Man movie, Spider-Man, right? I know it's a Spider-Man movie. In the first Spider-Man movie, Spider-Man got to a point where he didn't want to be Spider-Man anymore. He didn't want to use his power. And he got into a situation where a guy, I think the guy was robbing a store or the guy was carjacking somebody. I can't really remember the details. And he let the guy go on. He didn't use his power for the good. Later on that evening or that night, that same guy killed his uncle. So I relate that to the system. We have a lot of individuals, a lot of incarcerated citizens in the system right now, and law officials, government, us as a people. If we unify, we have the power to change them. But we don't use that power. And then we get mad when they return back into our communities and commit more crimes. Maybe they may rob my uncle. Maybe they may try to rob your grandmother. But my point being by saying that is, if we don't help rehabilitate incarcerated citizens, then the re-entry of those incarcerated citizens is going to be a lot of different struggles since I've re-entered society. And I'm apologize because I'm freestyling. I had a speech made up, but I don't have it right here because of this, so just bear with me. I'm not an exception. I don't believe that me and Sekwan are exceptions. It's a lot of positive individuals that's incarcerated that really want to change, that really want to rehabilitate themselves, really want citizens in society. What I will say that stuck out about me and Sekwan is we educated ourselves. We didn't depend on no programming, no self-help groups. We took hold of our situation and turned it into a positive. And as Sekwan could tell you, we would see each other in the day room reading every day, all day. That's all we did was read. Because we had a desire and a passion to change. A lot of individuals in there are not at that level. So they need guidance, they need ushering, they need programming, they need help from family, they need support from communities. They need a lot of things. It got to be a multi-dimensional approach. Because if it wasn't for education, Sekwan wouldn't be, and I wouldn't be in here washing dishes talking to y'all from Facebook Live. I would probably be locked back up. I was going to say I would probably be standing there. That was going to be a part of my speech, but since I'm not standing there. Um, we have a certain type of focus now that was conditioned while we was in prison. And like I say again, a lot of individuals are not on that level, so they need the ushering. They need that programming. Now, in society, right now, I'm a community outreach worker for concerted care group. I've started that job. Actually, I started the other day. I did orientation. But community development and community organizing has always been my passion. But it's very difficult to, I guess, any individual is very difficult to engage citizens around an issue. It's a different type of difficult when you are re-entering society and you have no computer training. You gotta learn how to do. You just learning how to use the email. You can barely work your phone. You have been incarcerated for so long and stuck on solitary confinement for so long that you are antisocial now. So it's hard for you to socialize with other people because you've been in a cage for so long. It's hard for you to network. It's hard for you to build that social capital. Also, I deal with, like, prison is traumatic. You know, you go through a lot of different things in there. Guards beating you up, guards spitting on you. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but you also have to deal with you also have to deal with your trauma when you get out of here. So I only say that to say that I sincerely believe that with the right assistance and guidance, that we can not only reform prison, but actually get more incarcerated citizens to come out in society and do the things that me and Sekwan are doing. And me and Sekwan deal with our own traumas. Sekwan isn't as antisocial as me. He'll tell you, like, I'm kind of antisocial. But it's ironic because I love speaking. So I can speak in front of 1,000 people, but when it's just me and you, I feel awkward. And it's probably because prison is so dehumanizing. But to get back on the point, I feel like a lot of incarcerated citizens can do the same thing with that type of support, that type of education, that type of rehabilitation. And we don't have to accept the model that prison has to be just punishment. You know, we can organize, we can write people, we can change laws, but we have to do it together. It had to be a collaborative effect. It has to be a lot of collaboration. I'm hopeful that, and I want to be a role model for individuals coming out of prison so they can kind of see the things that we are doing and fall in line and follow our footsteps. So I'm hopeful that more individuals coming out of prison, more incarcerated citizens will become productive citizens. That's my hope. That's my goal. And as my role, I'm doing mentoring. I'm doing community development. I'm doing everything in my ability. I'm doing everything that I had the ability to do to help that out. You know, I don't really like freestyle. You know, I like to write my speeches, but I'm kind of just speaking from the heart right now. I wish I could be there. You know, I hope everyone in there is sincerely focused on helping others. I think that's the main thing, us being of some service to others. Whether it be people in your community, people in your family, or a citizen that you don't know. I feel like that's the basic rule for all of us, just to try to be some service to others. And if we can do that on an individual basis, we take one footstep towards change. We take one footstep towards evolution, just transformation. So I feel like I'm obligated to play my part, because I was once a person that destroyed my community. Now I'm going to be a person that develops it. And I will not let no obstacle, no stepping stone get in my way. So I'm glad I get to speak to y'all on Facebook Live, because it shows that the system still can't stop us from speaking. Still can't stop.
I think you're crying, y'all. I think you're crying, man. I think you got him crying, man. I think you're crying,
I might
man.
shed a little tear, man.
Yeah, I think you're crying, man. I think we got him crying,
Just
y'all.
a little bit, little
So
tear.
we did it. We did it, man. All right, bro, man. Look, man. Love you, man. I'm going to get with you later, man. All right? That's usually how we end our conversation. All right, bro. All right. Thank all y'all.
Thanks for organizing that, too. All right, so that was inspirational, but this will be inspirational, too, in a different kind of way. You all know well, not everybody, because some people weren't here last night. We have this somewhat unusual format. These are the short takes speeches, and so I don't really introduce these folks, because they speak about themselves, so I just name them, but I don't really give any introductions. They're not a panel, even though they're sitting like a panel, because they weren't asked to address one particular topic. They're each going to give a short, provocative, thought-provoking talk. They've been chosen because their work is connected in certain subtle ways, but on the face of it, it's going to look like they're talking about fairly different things. And so you don't get to ask them any questions up here, because I just wanted to break the dynamic of somebody asking a question from the back of the room and the expert answering. So what happens is, after they've each spoken, you've got some time left in your tables, not too much time, but some time left in the tables just to look for connections, to process what you heard, and to say, actually, what she said connects to what he said in an interesting way. So it's going to be in the order that says on the program. Anjuli Fahlberg is first. I do have to say she's coming in to Tufts University as a sociology professor. That's new, so yay. Kelly Greenhill is already at Tufts University as a political science professor and my esteemed colleague and an expert on, among other things, the way that on propaganda and misinformation. And then Harry Boyte's been a friend of this enterprise for a long time, and will tell you he will tell you what he does. But I'm going to just turn it over to Anjuli. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. It seems to be that the theme so far has been, how do extremely marginalized and excluded people actually become civically engaged? And I get to continue on that theme. So for the last 4 years, I've been researching a group of really awe-inspiring people who've managed to work to improve their neighborhood and fight for their rights in probably some of the most extreme conditions. And so I want to tell you a little bit about how I got to know them, what they're doing, and why I think their stories matter for how we understand civic engagement. Now, the setting of my research is in a neighborhood called the City of God. City of God is located in the city of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And it looks like this from one angle. It's a neighborhood of about 60,000 inhabitants. It's actually surrounded by middle-class neighborhoods, but it was erected in the 1960s by the municipal government to house families that were being evicted from more desirable parts of the city, and they were brought here. And although a lot of places in the City of God actually look quite urbanized, it actually suffers from extremely high rates of poverty, unemployment, low educational levels, and a whole bunch of other issues that I don't have time to go into right now. And although poor neighborhoods are actually very common in every city. The City of God stands out because in the last couple of decades, it's become the global symbol of urban violence. Now, you've probably seen the movie or heard of the movie The City of God, which was released in 2002, and it depicts the extremely brutal tactics that drug traffickers have used since the 1970s in order to maintain control of the neighborhood. This is so they will process drugs in the City of God and as well as many other of Rio's poor neighborhoods, and then sell them often to wealthy customers across the city or export them along. And in order to, and I'll just note that most members of the drug trade in the City of God are local residents who were recruited often in their early teens, and most are young boys, often dark-skinned, who simply had very few alternative prospects for employment. I'll also note that about a fifth of Rio's population lives in a neighborhood controlled by these violent drug traffickers. And in order to protect their operations, they, both then and also now, drug traffickers co-opted all of the local residents associations, other neighborhood organizations, brutally killed residents who spoke out against them or challenged their authority, snitched to them to the police, or refused to obey their orders. Community leaders are the most susceptible to being killed or co-opted. And so as a result, many of the kinds of civic engagement that we're able to do in a place like the United States are actually not possible in a place like the City of God. At the same time, thanks to the war on drugs, constant invasions by heavily armed military police have resulted in massive shootouts, extremely high homicide rates. In 2017, in this neighborhood, there were 99 homicides. To put that in perspective, that's a rate of 165 per 100,000. Honduras, the deadliest country, has a rate of 90 per 100,000 homicides. Boston has a rate of 3. And the constant violence in the City of God has catapulted it onto the international media. And so if you ever read about it, it's about violence. Whether you're in Brazil or in the United States or in Europe, you will hear at some point about the City of God and all the types of violence. And so the consequence of this is, A, we come to think of poor neighborhoods in Rio as defined entirely by violence and criminality, but then residents of this neighborhood constantly get treated as criminals by potential employers, by the police, by workers at shopping centers, and so they get followed around by classmates in their universities. And so when I arrived in the City of God in 2014, like every other researcher who goes there, and many researchers do, even though it's very dangerous, I wanted to study violence and its effects on people. I was especially interested in a military operation that was happening. Now, I didn't end up there by accident. I actually grew up in Rio. My parents moved to Rio when I was 3 for work. And my mother worked in the City of God. She was a psychologist by training, and she worked with survivors of domestic violence. Now, she never actually brought me into the City of God because it was way too dangerous. And so I grew up exposed to poverty and inequality everywhere else, on the buses, in my church, on the streets, and listening to my mom talk about the things she had witnessed in the City of God. And so when we did move back to the United States when I was 12, it had been deeply ingrained in me that A, the world is unequal in just unimaginable ways, and that B, I had a role to play, or I had an obligation to do something to help in some small way. And so when I went into the field, or went into the City of God, I wasn't just interested in studying violence, but also in employing what we call participatory action research, which many of you are probably familiar with, which is based on the principle that as a researcher, you actually work with your participants to decide what you're going to study, what kind of questions you're going to ask, what methods you're going to use, and then how you're going to analyze the data, and how do you make that useful to the community. And so one of the first things that I did when I arrived in the City of God was I asked, if you were the researcher, what would you study? What is it that you want people in the world to know about the City of God? And every single person I talked to told me the same thing. They said, everybody talks about violence. We want somebody to talk about all of the great things that are happening in the City of God, all of the good things that people are doing. And so thanks to them, I embarked on a project of studying the good things that people were doing. Now, I had already worked with a friend of my mother's to get into a nonprofit organization there as a volunteer, because that's also part of the PAR model. And through this organization, I call it Youth Promise in my research, I met not only incredible staff who were working, this was actually an after-school program. You can see it was really difficult to be a volunteer there. This is a party that they had for kids. But I met more and more and more and more people who were all working to improve the neighborhood and to fight for the rights of residents. And over time, I've had the privilege of documenting all of the different things. So I want to give you some examples. So there are multiple community-based organizations that are constantly trying to bring resources into the neighborhood. This is an organization that works with the elderly around healthcare and preventing isolation. They're actually here taking a percussion class. I have a video of it, which is actually adorable. There are many organizations that work with youth, and as one of our panelists this morning was talking about, in addition to giving them things like education or training about how to get into an internship or well-paying job or social skills, they're also educating them about racism, structural violence, unjust public policies, capitalism, neoliberalism, teaching them all of these tools to become aware and political subjects of, on their own. This was a group of people who was constantly organizing around social development. So they would call their municipal government and say, we need a school, we need public housing, we need more resources at the health clinic. We need a community garden, a bank. And they were actually, with a lot of work, able to get a number of these projects put into the City of God. This was a group of cultural activists. They were all artists, so many of them were poets, or painters, or sculptors, or songwriters, or rappers. And once a month, they would get together in a bar. You can see this guy was here before the event started and decided to stay. And they would decorate the bar with flashing lights and fake flowers and paintings and a portrait of Frida Kahlo in the back. And they would rap and sing and perform about things like gender-based violence and police brutality and the ways in which favela residents' rights were being denied. And this particular man is dressed as a high school student, and he puts on this play pretending to be a high school student. It talks about all of the challenges that young people face just getting from their door to the school. So constant shootouts, or possibly being harassed by the police, and the list goes on. And people use their art to resist violence. So this was of one of the most vocal poets, and she writes, she posts this on Facebook, and it says, for breakfast, 2 loaves of bread and 11 bullets. And she had been on her way to buy bread and got stuck in a shootout and then collected the casings afterward. And this actually went viral because I think of its simplicity. This was an open mic that there's actually a whole circle of people that didn't make it into the picture, and it says, open mic, what do you think of the impeachment? And this was actually hosted in the main park in the City of God after the House of Representatives voted to impeach the president. And most people in the City of God were against this because the Labor Party has actually supported a lot of public policies that have been really helpful to its urban poor. And so this was an opportunity for favela residents who are rarely asked what they think of anything to actually get together and protest against violence and against inequality. This is a newspaper that gets put out every 3 months by a group of local residents. And a lot of the stories are about the fun things that people are doing, teaching kids how to roller skate or painting in the park. But then it also talks a lot about violence and insecurity. This article on the left is actually about a literary festival that they had attended, and some of the speakers are pictured there. And right outside, the police accidentally shot and killed an 8-year-old boy while the literary festival was happening. And the entire article is about here we are trying to make the world better while the government is actually destroying lives right outside our front door. And on the right-hand side is actually a picture of people who had just attended a training at the local Anglican church on how to prevent domestic violence and how to help survivors. And so we see violence and nonviolence happening concurrently everywhere we go. And when often when residents who are not officially part of the drug trade were killed, they would mobilize peaceful protests. And this actually reads, City of God demands peace. And take to the streets. Now, what actually allowed them to do this is one of the really important questions, because they couldn't mobilize thousands of people. Any kind of perceived leader of a large movement would be killed by the drug traffickers. And so they intentionally never talked about the drug trade directly. They also, almost every single leader was a woman. There were lots of men who worked in these projects, but they were not actually the face of the project, which probably would have been perceived as more directly threatening. Almost all of the public activities that they engaged in were things like care work, social development, art, culture, things that are perceived to be less threatening, more feminine, not political or explicitly political. And they also avoided any kind of large institutionalized movements, because then the leaders would have been at risk. And so instead, they had this piecemeal, fragmented, deinstitutionalized logic that allowed individuals to survive and not appear threatening to drug traffickers. The other thing that they did is they actually worked with social movements across the city. So many of them were involved in racial justice movements, gender justice movements, and they actually work with transnational movements. So people like us in the room, they would form allies with people all over the world who would actually, fly them to Germany or to the United States to talk about what they were doing, or would also come to Rio and help them mobilize. And so there was a lot of this making of alliances outside of the neighborhood. And so ultimately what this tells us, I think for me, it's been a lesson that even though the image that we have of places like the City of God is of despair and all we can do is survive, then in fact, people will find a way. That no matter how dire the conditions are, people find a way. But it often doesn't look like what we think it'll look like. Nowhere are these people in the newspaper. Nobody's talking about them. And in part, it's because they have to hide their activities. If they become too visible, they become a target. But that doesn't mean that they're not there. And so for me, the takeaway has also been, let's think about what civic engagement might look like in other contexts and recognize that just because it doesn't look like what we think it is, or what we think it should look like, doesn't mean that it isn't there, and doesn't mean that it's not doing really important things. Thank you.
What I'm going to talk about is a bit different. I guess I could quote Monty Python, right? But I think it's both very different, and yet, as Peter suggested on reflection, there might be more continuity, since some of what I'm going to say is how we can all be, and unfortunately, disenfranchised in the context of the war on our information ecosystem. So that's effectively what we're going to talk about today. So as we've all come to know far too well, misinformation, disinformation, and even outright fiction masquerading as fact can play havoc, absolute havoc with our information ecosystem, and thereby pose both direct and indirect threats to the health of democracies around the world. I think it's with this in mind that I've been asked to share some of the key takeaways from my forthcoming book, Fear and Present Danger, which focuses in part on the strategic deployment and manipulation of rumors, conspiracy theories, propaganda, so-called fake news, and other forms of what I call extra-factual information. And how EFI can be deployed in the service of political and military ends. And some examples include everything from changing the range of what is viewed as in changing the discourse about what are viewed as acceptable public policy outcomes, actually facilitating the introduction of new policy outcomes. And there we can be talking about anything from, say, detention of children to starting new wars or entering ongoing wars. Talk about I guess we're not going to have Q&A. People can buttonhole me afterwards and talk about other examples. So since a major theme of Fair and Present Danger is the power of a good narrative to both affect public attitudes and drive policy outcomes, I thought I would start with a story that I think you haven't heard before. So here we go. Once upon a time, clandestine agents employed fake news stories, propaganda, conspiracy theories, cooked polling data, and various and sundry other dirty political tricks, all as part of a foreign government's concerted yet covert attempt to influence the outcome of a national election inside the United States. You're probably saying, what are you talking about, Greenhill? I've heard this story before, and probably now about a gazillion times. But actually, you probably haven't, because the year in question is not 2016, but 1940. And the covert agents in question, not Russian, but British. So not only subjects of a democracy, but of the US's closest ally. So as World War II's raging in Britain, or well, I should say across Europe, under the explicit guidance of then Prime Minister Churchill, secret intelligence agents, SIS agents if you will, with the willing sometimes and sometimes unintentional support of surrogates inside the US, particularly journalists, decided, sort of if you will, decided to insert themselves into the US information ecosystem, turning our media environment and the information ecosystem into the front lines in a massive information campaign to bring the US into the war. So they inserted fake news stories into newspapers, radio programs, periodicals, in order to persuade Americans to elect candidates who favored entry into the war and to undermine support for isolationists. And to give you a sense of the magnitude of this task, a poll taken in July of 1940 suggested that about 29% of Americans were in favor of complete neutrality, and another 41% favored providing aid to the Allies, but staying out of hostilities. So we're talking about 70% of the US public who's not in favor of getting into what we eventually call the good war. So with their work cut out for them, between more or less the time of the British retreat across the Channel at Dunkirk and the US entry into the war after the attacks on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, these SIS operatives and their US surrogates flooded the US media with fake news, strategically leaked the results of illegal surveillance, often sexual surveillance, like creating scandals for certain candidates, publicizing it, sullying the reputations of these people, and employed a variety of other information operations against undesirable political candidates while placing favorable items in newspapers and other media to support those who favored entry into the war. Now, in addition, these intelligence agents also fed explicitly fake intelligence reports to US government officials, including, but not limited to, an alleged plot by the Nazis to overthrow the government in Bolivia, with the expectation that this would allow the Nazis to gain a foothold in the Americas. Now, we still don't know whether it was with his complicity or unwittingly, but FDR then repeated this alleged plot to the American public in the context of one of his famous fireside chats. So what we're talking about here is a clear, demonstrable attempt to subvert the democratic process to protect democracy. Now, was this a one-off? Obviously not, right? 2016, other cases makes clear that it wasn't. We're also, I think, all uncomfortably aware that attempts to use EFI to influence political decisions and political outcomes don't just emanate from abroad. So from the use of Hearst's newspapers to spread fictional stories of mass atrocities by the Spanish in Cuba that helped get us into the Spanish-American War, to LBJ seizing on, should we say, dubious reports of an alleged attack on U.S. naval vessel in the Tonkin Gulf, led to justification for the escalation of the Vietnam War. What turned out to be false testimony by a young woman before Congress, who later turned out to be the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the U.S., claimed that Iraqi soldiers were ripping babies from incubators in Kuwait to help. This was done in order to generate support for the first Gulf War. And of course, I probably don't need to remind everybody of all of the EFI that was spread around in the lead up to the 2003 invasion and occupation of the Iraq War. But it is worth remembering that at the time we invaded in March of 2003, 72% of Americans favored that intervention. Clearly, that little piece is not so convenient to remember. So, what are we to make of all of these? Well, and I guess I would be remiss if I didn't at least remind us that just in the last week, right, the current occupant of the White House has made unsubstantiated connections between immigration and rising crime rates, migration and refugees, fallacious claims about the origins of the zero detention policy, just to cite a few examples. Okay, so what do all these very diverse cases have in common? What can we say about the strategic manipulation of EFI and the very real-world consequences of all this made-up stuff? So I will offer 6 summary takeaways. Now, first, while this phenomenon is not new, and I'll come back to that in just a minute, it's true. Like many people say, we're now in a post-truth world and everything's different. It is true that we didn't have the internet and social media before, but this is not new, and moreover, the techniques and strategies used to encourage people to take on EFI as fact, bless you, they haven't changed, right? Our technology has changed, has shifted, but our brains haven't. The way we process information, why we're vulnerable, hasn't changed in the time that we've seen these tools used. Second, whether wittingly or unwittingly, and with their complicity or not, the fact-based media routinely play instrumental, really key roles, and they always have, right, in legitimizing, repeating, and proliferating EFI and turning it into material that can be treated as fact and often is in the ecosystem. The involvement of the Fourth Estate matters really profoundly because prior exposure, bless you, repetition, is one of the most significant variables. It's one of the 3 most significant variables that determine whether we treat EFI as plausibly or actually true. Indeed, in my own research, I've discovered, or I should say, studies have shown that having heard a particular rumor before, whether or not we believe it's true at the outset, will make us between 2.5 and 8 times more likely to treat it as plausibly true or as true. This finding comports with other things we know or other stages we've seen on the power of repetition. The other 2 variables of import are worldview and issue salience, and I'll say just a bit more about those 2 in just a minute. Now, so the criticality of these 3 variables, worldview, issue salience, and repetition, give rise to third takeaway, which is, again, I've said this already, but I think I might repeat it. We are all susceptible to EFI adoption. Right? None of us is immune. The really important thing is we all think we're immune. We actually, many of us, 60 or 70% of us think other people are susceptible, but virtually none of us think we are susceptible. But, at the end of the day, none of us is neutral. We all bring our worldviews, our attitudes, our beliefs, our values, how we interpret the world. We bring those to the table. The things we care about, the things we fear, the things that make us anxious, we all carry those with us. And so, if we hear things that sound like they're true, they're truthy to us, they move us emotionally, we're more likely to believe them, particularly if we've heard them before and if we care about the issues in question. And just as if you care, rumors that fit one's worldview makes about 50% more likely to treat them as plausible or true, and salience about 25% more likely. Fourth takeaway. Okay, repetition is important here too. While the current focus in the information ecosystem is strongly on fake news, fake news is a tiny piece of this, of the most effective EFI operations. Fake news, indeed, is usually employed as just a tiny component in broad-based carpet bombing, like thoroughly orchestrated information campaigns that require the active coordination of elites. And they can be elites inside government, outside government, at home or abroad, sometimes a combination of both. And again, most often with the assistance of handmaidens inside or outside government, sometimes willingly, sometimes accidentally. So what we're seeing now is just another manifestation of this long history of actors strategically cultivating and coupling, it's a fact, kernels of truth, the things that we know, we sense to be true, with EFI, sometimes in a minor way, sometimes in a very substantive way, to tap into our emotions and our fears to get us to be concerned. In my own research, I focus largely on threat and national security related issues, but the same phenomena holds across issues that have nothing to do with national security. It's really about worldview, salience, and repetition, tapping into emotions. So one way in which actors can do this, when focusing on the security implications of the security piece of it, is what I call threat conflation. And threat conflation is sort of exactly what it sounds like it is. Take a general, sometimes inchoate, underlying set of objective source of anxiety, say unregulated migration, just as a for instance, and add to that emotionally powerful, profoundly threatening, deeply troubling, but ultimately, at the time of transmission, unverifiable rumor, conspiracy theory, right? Some piece of EFI, to transform or transmute this general kind of inchoate, I don't quite feel comfortable about this, into something that is treated as an existential threat to a way of life, to national security, to who we are. So these can be social cultural threats, actual physical threats, existential threats to the survival of the state. That's the beauty and the power of threat conflation. Doesn't always work, but it works more often than we like to believe. And this comes back to my previous point about the strength and the importance of orchestration. When these things are truly successful, we don't see that they're orchestrated. This sounds like a conspiracy theory embedded in talking about conspiracy theories, but at the end of the day, people don't like to be tricked. They don't like to believe that they've been deceived. So the most successful of these campaigns appear like they're coming up from below, like they're grassroots, but the tentacles are there. There's a reason why things get repeated, right? They're in the media because someone keeps feeding them, or they get repeated, or certain people own media organizations where they can repeat it. And then mainstream media is forced to pick up and report what certain people in high office say, because that's the nature of media ecosystem. So these things don't happen accidentally. Or maybe occasionally they do, but the most successful ones don't. Finally, I would say, come back to what I said at the outset. This is as old as human communication. Again, technology has changed, but our brains haven't. As one observer put it, minced information is not like a plumbing problem you fix, right? It's a social condition that you manage, like crime, right? You have to constantly monitor it and adjust to it. But, this, on one hand, you could say, well, this is pretty grim, Greenhill. We can't solve this problem. But there's a silver lining here. Because this is a human condition, because it's something we adopt and adjust to, and because I've cited numerous examples of where we've been here before, because we've been here before, we know we can get through it and come out the other side. There are some models. There's a silver lining. There's a model, bless you, that we can respond and get through this. And indeed, there was a pretty significant, profound fake news crisis at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. And it's that out of that news crisis, fake news crisis, we got the New York Times and other, the value of fact-based media was recognized for a long period of time. That being said, can't rely on the Fourth Estate, can't rely on political leaders. It's incumbent upon each and every one of us to take responsibility, to ask questions. Where's this information coming from? What are the source? What's the motivation of the people who are sharing it with us? Before I click the share button, before I hit the like button, before I spread this further, do I trust this? Do I have a reason to trust this? Who else trusts this? Where is this coming from, and why? And every single one of us bears a responsibility. And so, as I said, we've been here before, and we can get past this one, but not by being complicit and not by counting on authorities or anyone else to solve the problem for us. So I guess this has come back to let's re-enfranchise ourselves. That wasn't part of my talk, but I think that's the takeaway lesson. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Harry Boyte at Augsburg University, creating with Mari Strum something called the Public Work Academy. Today I'm going to talk out of lessons from a new book. There's some flyers on the table and out there. It's called Awakening Democracy Through Public Work. Basically about 30 years of public work theory in the U.S. and around the world, including wonderful stories from Africa. I want to acknowledge that there are 3 co-authors of the book in the room. Mari has co-authored 2 chapters. Tammy Moore has co-authored a chapter on Eastern Europe, and Isaac Tranvik co-authored a chapter on reframing schools as civic centers. So in 2015, I spoke here about the shrinking of democracy, conceptually and practically. The talk didn't solve the problem. I want to come back not only to the problem and not mainly to the problem, but actually to what to do about it. And I want to take a particular angle of vision that we've worked on for 30 years, which is most civic engagement imagines it outside the world, institutional life, the fabric of society. Public work, for 30 years, we've sought to get inside institutions and professions to democratize and open them up. Our book has a lot of stories. It is possible, despite people's fatalism. But speaking of fatalism and the challenge of fatalism, I think it's worthwhile to start by honoring a mentor of mine, Dorothy Cotton, who died on June 10th. Her obituary in the New York Times was a substantial piece and a rare and long overdue tribute to her extraordinary role in the freedom movement. So Dorothy Cotton directed the citizenship education program of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Martin Luther King's organization. Her spirit filled the 900 citizenship schools across the South. I saw her inspiration all across the South. And then in the late 80s, when we started working through the Humphrey Institute on civic engagement, I invited her into our work, and she continued to inspire and energize our efforts with a civic spirit. I remember Dorothy speaking to undersecretaries of many federal agencies in our Reinventing Citizenship project, which we did with the Clinton White House from 93 to 95, in the Roosevelt Room in 1994. That was a spirit that's worth remembering, that we need today. Danielle Allen recently, in her commencement address at Pomona, talked about what she sees as the originalism of the founding documents, especially the Declaration of Independence. And she says, against the grain, that the real originalism is a sense that we are making the world and we can remake the world, that the world is in a constant process of change. So that's really my topic today. People are deeply fatalistic and skeptical about institutions. Ethan Zuckerman observes that his students at MIT are almost all distrustful of institutions. Schools, banks, businesses, nonprofits, churches, as well as public institutions, and they certainly are not alone. Even professionals are anti-institutional, as Noam Schreiber wrote recently in the New York Times. So it's understandable. I think we've seen a shrinking of what Max Weber called the iron cage over 100 years ago, the kind of technicization, the bureaucratization, the rationalization of many different institutions. But it is disastrous for those who believe in the promise and possibility of democracy to be skeptical or outside institutions is to consign ourselves to powerlessness, to marginality. It's also to lose the civic meeting grounds, which are the heart of a robust democratic culture where people of different backgrounds and interests and views interact and learn to work together. So here are 3 lessons out of awakening democracy through public work. First, the importance of making work more public, especially through what we call relational civic organizing. For institutions to develop civic identities, not simply engage in civic activities, which is the conventional pattern, requires breaking the pattern of rational, activity-focused work, not to ignore it, but to put it in the context of learning to work across differences with different kinds of people, across units, inside institutions and outside of institutions. And think politically about how to do that, and understand power relationships that include not only control over resources, but how to democratize knowledge systems in which some people's knowledge is credentialed and most people's knowledge is marginalized, which is not seen as scientific or academic. An example. So public achievement is our youth empowerment and civic education initiative. We have inspiring stories from all around the world of young people and what they can do, and a recent story from Stillwater Prison and in which inmates are doing public achievement. What we found is that for empowering civic work and political action to continue requires not only students or inmates, but it requires changes in the practices of people who have work in those institutions. So, for example, in schools, you cannot sustain something like public achievement unless educators, teachers themselves change, become more relational, more political, more hopeful, more relational. First lesson. Second lesson. Change in institutions requires a different understanding of power, related to the first. So today, activism as well as scholarship overwhelmingly tends to see power as one directional force, domination, power over. We need to rethink power is also in centrally involving power too. The Spanish word is poder, which is translated power too. And we have seen in multiple cases that to make real change involves rethinking power. So power is not simply dominating. In fact, one of the key things that young people learn in public achievement is what's called power mapping. There are many kinds of power in any situation. A really striking case in our work, and I would say that actually this goes to the problem that government is seen as usually the enemy, the target. And that's true for even broad-based community organizations, which are very skillful in developing people's public talents. But government is not imagined as a partner or a site for change, a democratic setting. A counterexample in the book and in our work is Eau Claire, Wisconsin, where the city manager, Mike Huggins, we'd worked with for years, and we'd worked with him in a project on teenage drinking that was directed by epidemiologists at the University of Minnesota, who believed that civic engagement meant getting communities to do what they wanted them to do. Well, Mike thought, this is a lot like city managers. City managers really think of themselves as consummate problem solvers. If they're not at the center of problem solving, what would happen? They don't even like to talk about power, and certainly not the invisible power that's based on knowledge, credentialing. But Mike thought that we need a different model of local government that is catalytic for the 21st century, that sees citizens at the center of democracy. So in 2007, he was able to organize a citywide effort called Clear Vision, highly diverse, for the first time involved low-income people, new immigrants, the business community, the government, University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, the community chest. And over 11 years, that has remarkable achievements like a $45 million Performing Arts Center, a $35 million Economic Development Initiative, a homeless shelter whose leading organizers were people who were returning citizens from jail, art through the city, many, many projects. But the most striking thing is that actually the culture of the city has changed in ways I'll talk about in a minute. Here, Clear Vision also illuminates the importance of place. So I would say, speaking to your point about propaganda, unless we recover places where diverse people with diverse ways of looking at the world interact on a continuing basis, we can't deal with the technological transformation we're facing. We've lost settings like local schools and libraries and congregations. We need to regain them. There's strong interest in this, so let me draw attention to the effort called Better Angels at its convention a couple of weeks ago, organized by a colleague of ours, Bill Doherty, who works on this concept of citizen professionals. So Better Angels involves equal numbers of Trump supporters and Clinton supporters. And at their convention, it's been getting a lot of publicity. There's going to be an ABC Nightline special about the convention. Their declaration makes this very key point that I think people understand. We are not any longer going to let ourselves be manipulated by those who would inflame our hatreds. It's not a love-in. They recognize serious differences, but they say we have manufactured hatreds towards each other, and we're going to reclaim our own citizenship. And we've seen in many cases the possibilities of that happening in places. So a couple of concluding examples. One is Eau Claire itself. So Clear Vision has not only had many projects, it's a citizen-driven initiative that develops people's talents and public skills in community settings and in institutions. What we've seen in Clear Vision is that a community context accelerates the possibilities of institutional and professional change because people see many examples. They don't feel like they're crazy. They don't feel alone. We've always found citizens love the idea of being a citizen professional. It's very hard to do in practice because you feel you're going against the whole world. In a community context, there are many examples in Eau Claire of a cooperative extension of the local financial institutions, of government, of schools, seeing real change in professional and institutional cultures. First point. Second example, in Northwest Iowa, the public achievement effort was having real impact. Foundation Heartland decided to take it to scale throughout the rural area because 75% of young people were leaving their local communities. So they developed an initiative in which tens of thousands, more than 20,000 young people have done public work projects. And the evaluations they've done show a major turnaround in terms of young people staying in the communities because they feel they're helping to create them, they're visible, but also, there hasn't been evaluation of this, but the leaders I've talked to say that process has had huge impact on professionals and leaders and even politicians in the region. So I would say the next frontier of democracy is to bring our talents and our energies to the democratization of professionals and systems. I note that young people today, especially coming out of college and having experiences in civic life, have a very strong interest in continuing to be civically involved. And the research also shows, this is also what we find anecdotally, that they do not want to separate civic engagement from their professional lives. But differently, they want to be agents in turning jobs into what we call public work. So that's the next frontier of democracy. Thank you.
So I think we can all do this. We can put those together. Just bouncing around thoughts about what it's like to organize when you're not allowed to appear in public versus public work, and what the role of the state in all of this is when the state can manipulate, but also can be a place where public work is done. So you only have 15 minutes right now to think about it, so just use it as kind of agenda setting time. Throw some ideas around at your tables, and then I'm going to interrupt you again in 15 minutes and send you to a breakout room.